the Tribit Stormbox Blast, but the Tribit Stormbox Blast in EQ mode versus the Motion Boom Plus in EQ mode. You asked for it. You think, some of you think my EQ is not too bad. Others think I'm deaf. Do you know what? I'm not deaf. I might just have a different taste to you. And also, you said to me, wow, that's not a bad W-King speaker. Who would have thought the W-King D10, by the way, if you go on the W-King website and you look for the D10, it's got a picture of the X10. I don't know what's going on. I don't know why they just give them proper names. Give them proper names that people want to talk about affectionately. I used to do mattresses, and do you know what? They used to call them Lisa and Casper and Emma and lovely, gentle names like that. We got the W-King D10, the T9, and tanks and stuff like that comes to mind. But however, I digress. No surprise there. The W-King D10 was a surprise. Not too bad for a W-King speaker. You actually thought maybe it could hold its own against the Motion Boom Plus. I said no, different league. And you even said that about the Tribit Stormbox Blast. And I said differently. But you know what? It's no good saying it. We got to listen. Was I right? Was I wrong? We're going to find out, because this is about EQ versus EQ. Remember, we've done default modes. Certainly did default in the Motion Boom Plus video. And I have to point out, when we first tested the Motion Boom Plus, it went blinking loud for the weight and the whole package. And the amount of punch that it has. But now they've been bringing gradually down the mids and the highs and bringing down that 6 kilohertz peak. That is reducing the volume. Not insignificantly, but I think at least a couple of decibels from when we first tested it. And my EQ brings it down a little bit more further, because I'm even still trying to tame those highs, make it a little bit more natural. So bear in mind, this is EQ mode. Both will sound different. That will sound worse in signature mode, but X-Bass on, I think, if you just want the bass, go for X-Bass mode. It's where it maximizes the X-Bass. But there is a bit of like a nasally nature to the highs, and I've tried to tame that personally with my custom EQ while keeping as much bass as we can. But even going into custom EQ, unless you're going to start losing volume by reducing mids and highs relative to bass, you can't get more bass than you get on X-Bass. So I said just go for X-Bass. And then we got the default mode. There's no app to put your own EQ in, and I'm only doing it when they've got their own app. It supports that particular speaker, and it gets embedded in the firmware. So all three speakers compared. We'll start off with the Stormbox Blast versus the W-King D10. For me, surely this has got to be a thrashing for the W-King D10, because W-King D10, it just gives you some upper bass, and that's it. And that's it. If you get a W-King speaker, you must be in the school playground. I know I talk about it, you know, in the same way as you talk about kitchen radios. It just means something inside my head. It probably means absolutely nothing to you. But this is more of an outdoor, you're out splashing around with a pool sort of fun speaker. This is never meant to be, in my opinion, or generally in W-King speakers, never meant to be a serious listen. However, I found the T9 was a decent old listen, just didn't have much bass. So, W-King D10 versus the beast that is the Tribit Stormbox Blast. It has lights, and do you know what else it has? It has the JBL Boombox 2 woofers. It's got the same woofers apparently. However, I've pointed out, well, to me anyway, you know, JBL use multiple parts in so-called same speakers. They seem to think nothing of doing that, and actually to the extent where different models sound, well, the same model, but different versions of the speaker just sound different. But these are the woofers from the Boombox in a package half the price. That is brilliant. And not only that, you've got loads of other things. I know JBL Boombox 2 just got EQ, but this has got proper EQ, multi-band EQ. Let's see where we are now. Tribit Stormbox Blast versus W-King D10.
Yeah, you were right this time, you were right this time. Take a look around, look what you did last night. What you did last night, never heard a sound. Yeah, I know that you told me one day you'd show that you were right this time, you were right this time. Oh no, now the truth comes out and I know that you warned me about it. Shallow, we were only ever in for a shower.
predicted it. I predicted it before the event. I said, that's got no chance against the Blast. Obviously, it's going to depend on where your priorities are. But for me, sounds thin and not much happening there against the full-bodied Tribit Stormbox Blast with its very, very deep bass. But I have to point out, big differences in these speakers. We'll get to the specs at the end, but we're talking 5.5 kilos, just over 3 kilos. So it's nearly half the weight of that. We've got to point out these differences, and indeed in terms of price. I could get that today, 90 quid. Amazon UK, Amazon US, $108. The Tribit Storm, you can't get the Blast at the moment, as far as I can see, completely sold out. But we expect it, when it comes back, to be about 160 quid, $200. So, you know, nearly half the weight, nearly half the price. You get what you pay for, and certainly at these volumes. So let's go to the Boom Plus versus the D10. So we know it doesn't have deep bass on the Tribit Stormbox Blast, on the Motion Boom Plus, but we also know it's got a lot of punch. It's got a lot of upper bass. That's got a lot of upper. I mean, it's all upper bass on the W-King D10. It may be this is going to be the one that's interesting. The D10, which in my head was not really going to match the Motion Boom Plus. What happened in reality? Got to say, again, I think it's a win for the Motion Boom Plus, but not by as far as against the Tribit Stormbox Blast, because that also doesn't have deep bass, so the differences are going to be slightly different. Here we're talking upper bass versus upper bass. I would say this sounds more open. It just sounds more going on. It sounds more detailed, and yet we actually do have more highs on the W-King D10, and actually overall bass is bigger. When you take in deep bass, mid bass, upper bass, it's bigger on the D10 because of how much it's pushing the upper bass. No surprise there. You buy a W-King speaker, should know what their favoured tuning is. The issue for me, I think, for the W-King is, given the size of the enclosure, how close the woofers are. That it does have a narrow soundstage, but it sounds open and airy. It could sound a lot worse than it could sound a lot worse than it does because of the nature of the woofers being that close. But it does other things right and enough to overcome that. But these are a little bit more spaced out, and it's overall it sounds wider, sounds more open, it sounds more of a sound stage, and I prefer the difference. I prefer the Stormbox Blast, but the Motion Boom Plus, but of course it's more expensive. How much is it out? Around £170, $180. So again, way cheaper, $90. 100. So it's kind of going with the pricing, but still, that is good value. But for me, I wouldn't say either of these are serious speakers. I just think these volumes, which are decently loud volumes, to be fair, and this has a weird volume scale where as you get to the higher volumes, you don't really get that much more volume out of it. And it'd be interesting to see what happens at maximum volume. So I do think now for me, with my custom EQ, this is now a reasonable listen. I would think, if I've got a choice of speakers, it would be one of them that I would pick up and have a listen, an enjoyable listen. But it's still going to have that edgy nature to it. You can't really get away from that, but at least it's not as harsh as it was. But of course, the real question is, custom EQ, picking that one up, and I don't really want to put it behind the other one. This is the heavy one. This is the heavy bugger, 5.5 kilos. Custom EQ versus a custom EQ. That's what we're waiting to find out. And we're going to do that right now.
Been on the streets a few months. I'm trying to pick myself up. I may be living alone, but I still believe in love. And although my flaws had dragged me down on the coldest night, I'm still kicking around. And then I saw you back before my time was shortened. No, throughout my life you've called me a renegade. Throughout my loves you said we could start again, but I'm a renegade of your love. But I'm a renegade of your
Loudness matched at these volumes. Stormbox Blast dominates in terms of bass, except for the upper bass where the D10 has its big push. And the Boom Plus doesn't take over in terms of bass from the D10 till we're getting towards 80 Hertz, where the D10 in terms of bass has the big roll-off. Only one speaker here doing deep bass, 60 Hertz and down. It's the Stormbox Blast. If we look at the peaks, there is a big peak, 9 kHz on the D10. And of course, for me, on my Stormbox Blast, I have a big 5.5 kHz dip, a bit unfortunate. It's going to rob it of some clarity. Breaking all that down, the Stormbox Blast versus the D10, it's the Stormbox Blast that dominates the bass, except for the upper bass where the D10 has a big push. We see a big contrast around the 5 kHz where we have a bit of a peak on the D10 and a dip on the Stormbox Blast. And that peak for the D10, again, at 9 kHz. Slightly stronger in the mids for the Stormbox Blast. Motion Boom Plus versus the D10. Again, obviously the D10 has a big upper bass push and that's where it dominates. Boom Plus takes over 90 Hertz and down. Otherwise, pretty similar, pretty much in line with each other till you hit the peak again of the D10, 9 kHz. And the Motion Boom Plus extends a little bit more into the harmonics. Stormbox Blast versus the Motion Boom Plus. Deep bass only goes to the Stormbox Blast. And in fact, it dominates everywhere except for around 65 Hertz to around 80 Hertz where they are neck and neck. Again, nothing major between them in terms of the rest of the frequency response till you hit the dip for the 5.5 kHz for the Stormbox Blast. And the Boom Plus, a little bit of a dip, around 1.5 kHz.
One major clear difference is sounds brighter, sounds deeper. So quite a difference in sound signatures. Darker, brighter, but more edgy. When loudness matched, there is a bigger bass all over. upper bass, mid bass, deep bass. It's just bigger on the Blast. It's just more immersive. It's just a hell of a lot more fun. For me, it's a shame there's a 5.5 kilohertz, quite a big 5.5 kilohertz dip on mine. I've only had one report of someone else saying, yeah, theirs has the similar. I'm waiting for someone else to do measurements or something. Is it just mine, or are they all like that? But it's warmer. They do enough right, and there's enough difference in the sound signature that you will prefer one over the other without saying one is terrible. But the differences are very stark, much thinner, more nasally, brighter. You may say more sparkly, but darker. But for me, more immersive because of that bass. I like a warm sound, and it's a soft, woolly bass. If you like a tight, so-called fast bass, although I think fast bass really is more about upper bass, it still may not be the bass for you, but for me, personally, and if you're looking for deep bass, that's the speaker. But there are major differences, not least the weight, the price, and a load of other things. We'll get the specs in the end. So what are already decent listening volumes, for me, Tribit Stormbox Blast is clear winner. However, if you're going portable, that's still a great package for how loud it goes and how light it is and how much punch there is. It's just a different type of listen on the Blast, which is I prefer. And while still not bad at all for a W-King speaker, it's in third place for me at these volumes, but it's the cheapest, so offering the best value. So all have a place. All come into the reckoning when you take out your wallet and you reckon I've got 107 quid there, and it can only be the W-King D10 probably then. So the real kicker, maximum volume. Remember, these are custom EQ. We always lose volume. Well, normally lose volume custom EQ. And you tend to lose bass. You tend to get more bass when you go back to some of the default modes, like X-Bass mode. But I'm leaving it in custom EQ because it was about custom EQ test. Just bear in mind, in the real world, you go to these loud volumes, you may want to actually switch back to some of the default modes, certainly for a bit more bass. And we've got an EQ mode on the W-King D10. You just got to press their so-called EQ thing, and it starts flashing blue there. You're in EQ mode. So that's 4 modes: default, EQ, custom, maximum volume, what's the headroom, how loud they go, blah, 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 blah.
Surrender, that ain't never in my blood. I've been running with my soldiers and we climbing to the top. Man, I will make it working. I'm like, what? You show me what you have, show me what you gotta know that I can take it. Oh, take it through the chest. I've been through some dark times, way up in the past, so I've been really funny for it all. I'm like, damn, you wanna bring it on? Well, you better be a champ, cause I keep on running through the rain, cause I keep on going through this pain, cause I keep on carving my way, cause I keep on moving away. Y'all just wanna stop me, but there is no way, cause I've been different, I've been marching, I'm fighting myself away. I'm running through the mountains in my time, I do not waste, cause I be busy working, I be grinding nowadays. Hey, what you got? Constantly grinding on with the team. What you know about losing your sleep just for a dream? What you know about making some waves up in the scene? Cause I'm the one that's doing it, well y'all just make it sing. Y'all make it seem like this should not be seen, like this ain't really proper, but I'm rising all above and I'm flying like I'm a chopper. Cause I'ma get it poppin', yes I gotta get it rockin'. While the people always tell me that I've been really nothing, but I proved them wrong, yeah. Yes, I've been me, and I've been strong, yeah. And you will see that, oh I've been on, yeah. A mission I've been really rising up to the top. Hey, to the top in this lane, yeah, I make it work. Cause I just know my effort, I know my worth. And I just know I'm next, yeah, I know that I deserve everything I'm getting. So I will make it work, I will make it worth it, I will get it. And I ain't gonna go panic, cause I am not like your breast, but I'm not so dramatic. And y'all just don't get it, man, that's what it is. Cause I'm really up on this, bigger waves up in this bitch. your sleeve just for a drink. What you know about making some waves up in the scene? Cause I'm the one that's doing it, well y'all just make it seem.
Maximum volume. It's not a million miles between all three of them. In pure lufts, it's the D10 in EQ mode that goes the loudest. It does that because it's reducing the bass and boosting the highs. Just over half a decibel louder, just over half a decibel quieter. The Stormbox Blast in custom mode, but it's more impressive for the blast because it's holding on to its deep bass. Then we get D10 in default mode. It strikes me it's holding on to a lot of upper bass, the D10 in its default mode, given how loud it's going. And it's the Motion Boom Plus in custom mode that's the quietest in pure lufts, half a decibel behind the D10 in its default mode. But it does have a bigger peak, the Motion Boom Plus. They all go pretty loud, less than 2 decibels, even in peak terms, between the quietest, the D10 in default mode, and the Stormbox Blast in its custom mode. D10 in default mode has the most upper bass. Indeed, it even has the most mid bass. And then, of course, rolled off. But in terms of that deeper bass, it's Stormbox Blast that's out on its own. But again, a bit of a surprise. It's the D10 in default mode that has a smidgen more in terms of the deep bass over the Motion Boom Plus. And the most, in terms of the highs, is the D10 in EQ mode, which makes it quite unpleasant, really. But overall, there's pluses and minuses for any one of these speakers.
So, it was a shocker to me. Let's get one thing out of the way first. EQ mode on the W-King D10. I mean, not an absolute scrooge fest, but it's not a nice listen. Only if you want maximum volume. And indeed, if you want maximum volume, it's the loudest. It's the loudest by 0.7 of a decibel on that particular test over the Stormbox Blast. And if it's all about loudness, you'll go for that. Remember, Stormbox Blast is still maintaining its deep bass. There's more mid bass. So in default mode, that's in default mode on the D10, again, shock, 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 has the most bass overall. Because of how much upper bass, surprisingly, it's actually kept in default mode. Absolute shocker. It's just that it's got loads more deep bass on the Blast, and of course takes more of the amp, so that's why it's not maintaining overall volume, but it is maintaining that low end kick. But it's quite a dark sound now. We're losing some of the highs. Well, there's some peaks there that are making it a bit unpleasant, but I wouldn't say it's over boosted altogether in the highs. So, but it's enough. It's enough that it's a dark sound because it's not bright enough, but there's enough in the terms of maybe those peaks we don't want where it may be a little bit screechy. Whereas that's actually a bit balanced at maximum volume. You could almost say maybe it's a bit dull, but it's got the most bass. It's the cheapest. It's the lightest. Soundcore Motion Boom Plus in default mode. Of course, we've already had a couple of tweaks from Soundcore themselves where you're going to lose volume because they brought down some of the highs. And again, my EQ will bring down the highs. It will go louder in the default mode, but it'll sound more screechy, that's for sure. And you can, of course, use a custom EQ where you're pushing the highs anyway, and the mids, and maybe reduce the bass if you're going for maximum volume. But in this particular test, it was the quietest. I have to say, there's not a lot between all of them. You can make a case for any one of these at maximum volume being the best listen. If you want deep bass, you could say it's going to be the Blast. If you just want something that's still a little bit balanced, I would actually say go for the D10. And then with the Motion Boom Plus, surprising now, it's actually got the least in terms of highs after EQ because we're trying to still tame some of the edginess. Its overall sound signature may just be something you prefer. You may find actually that's cutting through more of the background, and the D10 may sound a bit flat. So I'm going to say I think the W-King D10. Look, I'm only saying that at maximum volume, the fact that it's holding its own against these more expensive speakers. Motion Boom at 2.4 kilos is the heaviest, and then 3 kilos for W-King 10. Well, in terms of price anyway, it may be the winner because of how it keeps together at maximum volume, but not in any other volume. I would still listen to all the both of these two at lower volumes. I find them more satisfying. So that's pretty much the roundup. Remember, that's my custom EQ. Your results were completely different if you use a different EQ, of course. However, I think universally we can say signature mode on the Motion Boom Plus is awful, in my personal opinion. It's just so hollow and it's hard to understand how they've come to that. Overall enjoyment, it's going to be the Tribit Stormbox Blast. We're going to do the specs, and that's the thing. It's the heaviest, it's the most expensive. You get what you pay for. Sometimes, and certainly in this particular test, that's what happens. if you can take the weight. So, in terms of overall specs, all made where? In Switzerland, no, France, no, Australia, no, made in China. Motion Boom Plus, about 170 quid, $180. The W-King D10, about £90, $108. Tribit Stormbox Blast, about £160, $200. All SBC codecs, of course. In terms of those batteries, massive batteries, 71.3 watt hours on the Blast. It's a decent battery on the D10. Again, another plus for the D10, 57.7 watt hours. Just 46.1 watt hours on the Motion Boom Plus. It's a little bit under spec for how loud it goes. It's Bluetooth 5.3 for the Plus. It's also Bluetooth 5.3 for the Blast, and it's Bluetooth 5 for the D10. All do stereo pairing. The Motion Boom Plus will also do partycast over 100 speakers. Can't do party mode for multiple speakers on the other two speakers. USB-C connection, mains lead. Come on. Why'd you do that? Come on. Why'd you do that? Come on. Why'd you do that? There's always a negative, isn't there? That's the big negative, having to use a mains lead for charging. And here's the big one. This is the Karaoke King, because you can use your microphone on the W-King D10. You can't do that on the other two, and you may say, why would I want to? The reason why you'd want to is because you want to do some karaoke. You love karaoke, and you're going to practice before you go out, and when you get there, you're going to pretend you never practiced at all. All have auxiliary input, can all be used as a power bank, you can use them as a phone speaker, but you can't use the Stormbox Blast to make phone calls. Have you tried that? Hello, anybody there? No, that is not going to work. Only the W-King D10 offers you the opportunity to use a micro SD card to actually play your music off of the speaker itself without having to use another device. Someone said in the comments, I don't want to do that, I don't want to do that. You might not want to. Do you know what? There's other people in the world, and they may want to. Massive, massive, massive negative for the Soundcore Motion Boom Plus. Can you spot what it is? Can you spot what it is? If you have a power cut and you don't have any lights, you won't be able to see your way with the Motion Boom Plus because it's got no lights. It's got no lights. Oh my goodness, how would they ever think that would be a good idea? Because this day and age we want lights. Oh, go and have a comment. I don't know how you want lights. As I said before, I said it again, in my personal opinion, nothing wrong with lights. If it's obviously it's going to drain your battery a little bit quicker, but you can turn them off. You don't like it, turn it off. It's not compulsory. And do you know what? I just think it adds a bit of ambience, and I quite like speakers with lights. Call me new-fashioned if you want, because obviously in the old days, you'd have to shine a light on it if you wanted any light at all. In the official specs, I don't take notice of this anymore, but I will tell you the Motion Boom Plus is said to be 80 watts, the Blast 90 watts, and the D10 70 watts. 2.4 kilos, 5.5 kilos, 3.1 kilos. D10, they don't like having IPX7. I don't. Is it? Obviously, they've got to pay to get these certificated. Is that the right word? They pay for the licensing, whatever, to have it tested to be IPX7. I don't know. Is it cheaper IPX6? Because they all seem to come up with IPX6 or 5, but not IPX7 on the W-King range. But we do have IPX7, which means, well, by now we all know you can drop it in 1 metre water for 30 seconds. But it needs to float, otherwise you'd still be in trouble. It's a massive surprise to me. There, the Stormbox Blast floats. And not only does it float with the drivers up. 5.5 kilos, and they can't do that on little tiny speakers. That is a big, huge, massive plus in my terms. That will float, but it won't float with the drivers up. In terms of the drivers themselves, we've got the smallest drivers. Again, shows how well this is doing by holding up at maximum volume, because 70mm woofers, I measure two 30mm tweeters, two passive radiators, versus 90mm woofers, 25mm tweeters, and the woofers are titanium, and the Blast, it's got the Boombox 2 woofers, and indeed 107mm woofers, two 30mm tweeters, two passive radiators. We said they've all got auxiliary inputs, and that's really, really good. As long as we don't get lag, that's the whole point. We don't want lag, because Bluetooth, you're going to get lag, whether you notice it or not. It's going to be some lag. It's the nature of going wireless. Now, We want naught. So I measured within what I can measure, which is within about 20 milliseconds. The Motion Boom Plus, basically no lag in auxiliary mode. Stormbox Blast, the same. 50 milliseconds lag, which is low, but for an auxiliary, you actually want it a bit lower. So you depend, as I said, if you're DJing and it really has to be absolutely 100% in sync, that may be a no-go. In terms of Bluetooth, 33 milliseconds is fantastic on the Motion Boom Plus. 83 milliseconds on the just scrapes in. 80 milliseconds is my cutoff point, so it's usable. But it could be better on the Blast, but still usable, and you may not even notice any lip sync when you're streaming. 133 milliseconds is not good streaming over Bluetooth with the W-King D10. We've got an app, we've got EQ. We've got an app, it's got EQ, there's no app. The future seems to be app. They're all gradually moving over to apps. And for most of them, it's a game changer. It's been a game changer. Well, it's not a game changer. Why did you say it was a game changer, Al? I don't know. Sometimes I just have these lines in my head and I don't think it through. And I said, it's a game changer. It's not a game changer. X-Bass would be fantastic mode, even if it was the only mode. But it just makes it a nicer package. To have a multi-band slider EQ in the app, it does work pretty well. Just know you can't get more bass than you'd get in X-Bass mode without losing a volume. I don't like losing volume. That's why I don't reduce mids and the highs, even if you could actually do it all the way around. But I don't do it mainly because you're going to leave lots of peaks elsewhere. There's only certain sliders. It's not a coincidence why they give you those certain sliders to mess about with. So that's been my roundup. I think overall the W-King D10 comes out as a good value package. It was a surprise to me. It still wouldn't be a speaker I would pick up and listen to because it still sounds budget to me. It's still a little bit compressed. Look, I talk about it being open airy, but yet having a narrow soundstage. It does a lot of things right, but not enough for me. I'm not going to say it. Well, yeah, I'll say it for a serious listen. As a party speaker, absolutely bang on. It will do the job for the money, and it goes loud, and just don't have deep bass. But I think it's good value for money, but it's still... I kind of would rather pick up the Motion Boom Plus if I got the choice of the two. In EQ mode, it now sounds better to my ears, but it's got an edgy nature. You need to keep that in mind. But the best package here is the Tribit Stormbox Blast. It simply puts a smile on my face. I really, really love listening to it. Yes, it could be more detailed, but what it does as a package is simply enjoyable. Still could be more detailed. I've got that 5.5 kilohertz dip. A bit of a tragedy, really, given everything else that is doing right. But it's still the best package, even as it's the most expensive for the weight. I think because of the size, it's still very usable. Just bear in mind, it is heavy. So there you go. Something to say for each of these speakers. And it's going to be a matter of opinion what you can afford, or what your listening tastes are, and what your end scenario is. That remains probably the pound for pound champion, as in going light, but still having lots of volume and lots of punch. But unfortunately now, until you hit maximum volume, that's because they reduced the mids and the highs. When they could have just reduced the 6 kilohertz peak and left the rest as it was, because reducing the mids and highs is not translating at maximum volume because it's still hitting the bass limit. So instead of EQing it in a clever way where once you've hit that bass limit, they still let you get the old levels for the mids and the highs just because you want more volume. No, it's still overall reduced. So it's significantly quieter than when we first tested. Yeah, at lower volumes, significantly easier on the ears and more enjoyable. But in terms of the volume, the kicker is he lost a lot of volume. That's been my roundup. I hope you got something out of this video. I hope to see you in another video. Thank you for watching.
I ain't about that life. I ain't about that life. Ain't no project wife, got my logic right, cause I'm not your type. I ain't about that life. I ain't about that life. Sorry, ma, I ain't get it right. I'ma just live my life. I ain't about that. I ain't about that life.